My name's Adrian Renouf and I'm the facilitator for this session today. Essentially, this session will focus on the application of behavioural insights, particularly in the corporate sector, but some of our speakers will also talk about application in the public sector. Essentially, we've got a very diverse panel, which I'll introduce individually as they get up to speak. But we're very lucky to have people that have a wealth of experience working across government and in the corporate sector, and in particular coming from a very diverse range of industries. We have people with backgrounds in financial services, wealth management, academia, technology, and government. So what I'd like to do is introduce our first speaker, Mike Pratt, who is the New South Wales Government's Customer Service Commissioner. Mike has had an extensive career in banking and wealth management in Australia, New Zealand and Asia, and has held a series of senior executive roles with banks, including being the CEO of NAB Australia and the CEO of the Bank of New Zealand. Mike, I think, has been in the role of Customer Service Commissioner now for a couple of years and was one of the significant appointments from the incoming O'Farrell government as part of the government's commitment to make a fundamental difference in the way customers and citizens interacted with government. So would you please join me in welcoming Mike to the podium?
Thank you and good morning, everybody. Good to be with you. Commissioner for Service in government, that is not a contradiction in terms. The government has really made a serious commitment to addressing service transformation. And in the short time available this morning, I'll give you a little sense of why we're doing what we're doing and a little sense of some of the results and the impact. And I'm sure we can talk more about it in the Q&A. I've titled that deliberately around what I see as a customer imperative, and that is to get customer inside government. And I mean that in the whole policy chain through to delivery. So this is not just about delivery, although I'll focus on that this morning, but a genuine commitment here to involve the citizen much more back up the value chain into policy formulation. And the reality is that's what citizens want. And the days of formulating policy in the back room, as we do, and then going out and ticking a box called consult to the community have to change. And that's driven a lot by technology and a lot by open and transparency now around the way we all operate, be we government, be we corporate citizens or whatever. So quite deliberately, this whole notion of customer inside is right through that value chain. And we're finalising a white paper on this, will be finished in the next couple of months, on how we're thinking about actually executing against that. So I'm going to touch on a few issues quickly this morning. But first of all, what's actually happening with citizens in the community? Simple slide to demonstrate the change and the pace of change. So 2005, Pope Benedict. 2013, Pope Francis. You'll see one phone in that bottom right corner, when in 2005 with Pope Benedict. Look at the difference. In the space of only 8 years, that's what you and I have signed up to. The capability we now have, and increasingly more and more capability in our mobile phone now, our handset, is changing remarkably, and the pace and the velocity of that is increasing significantly. Now, my background is banking, and so if I look at banks, they have been the forerunners in a lot of this development, mainly because they have deep pockets, but also they have huge customer bases, and you and I are demanding that of banks. And if you look at internet log-on patterns, for example, the number of you in this room that log on at 2:30 in the morning to pay your bills would be amazing if I did a straw poll. Your behaviour patterns have fundamentally changed because of what you now see is available to you. And I think one of those inflection moments was when Apple put their iPhone to market, and suddenly we could see what we could do with our handheld. And so I use that as the context of a lot of this in terms of the work we're doing, because the reality is that the expectations of you as a citizen of government are way out here, because that's what you're getting from telcos and banks and other retail providers. The reality is government's back here. So we have a huge opportunity now, not only to close an expectation gap, but because we're so far behind, to actually leapfrog some of the technology and actually get ahead in some areas. So the expectations of you and I are changing rapidly, and I've just listed a few things here around what I'm seeing, and this work has been based on a huge amount of research that we've done here with the citizens and the businesses of New South Wales. But fundamentally, it is driven by technology, and it's also a requirement now of citizens and businesses that they actually get inside government to understand what is going on. And highlighted even more so more recently in this state with ipac, unfortunately. But you and I are demanding more transparency within government. At the start of this work, just over 2 years ago now, we did a huge piece of research and we looked at 35 case studies around the world of governments that were doing some work in this space. And for me, it was really valuable because being new to the public sector, it was great for me to do this to get a really up-to-date understanding of what was happening. And we looked at what's gone on, for example, in New York with 311, some of you will be familiar with, which is a huge initiative around contact centre capability. We looked at Singapore that have done a huge amount of work on e-government, have done things like crowdsourcing with over 300 apps in government coming from that initiative. We've looked at UK, digital by default, and so on. These were just a summary of some of our findings. Now, none of this, I'd suggest, will surprise you. And probably you tick every one of those and say, knew that, knew that, knew that. But my simple point on this slide is it's the combination of these working together that actually brings about successful reform in government. It's not just one of them. And these were the core characteristics as I looked around about how do we execute successful reform. Because what we've done in New South Wales over the last 2 years with the creation of Service New South Wales, which is the front-end delivery now of transactions for government, it's not groundbreaking. It's been tried before, but inevitably it's failed because we lack some of the things that I've got on this slide. So this was a good learning for us in terms of going into this work. So customer inside, I've talked a little bit about why we think that's important, but these are some of the other core things that I've got through feedback from citizens. And I guess a key point, and I use the term citizen and customer interchangeably, one can argue whether in fact you and I as citizens are true customers of government, re contestability and so on. But my simple view on that is that that's not the issue. The issue is if you're bringing about fundamental change in government, the nomenclature is important. And starting to use the word customer in government brings a whole new conversation rather than citizen. And so it's really important around the terminology that we use. So these are some of the things that we're looking at. Now, the bottom point there is really the key one. We're not doing this fundamentally because we want you and I to be happy citizens. We'd like you to be happy citizens. But my fundamental premise is if we can improve the underlying performance of the economy, then we have a much better opportunity of having happy citizens. And if you execute this well from all the research that I've looked at, if you have more time as a citizen or as a business to spend on your business or doing your own, whatever it might be, rather than waiting in queues to deal with countless numbers of government folk, there's a huge productivity advantage in that. It really does demand a new approach. And I've listed here a number of things which you'll be familiar with. But if I take things like predictive personalisation, I mean, that's a given now in a number of sectors. This is no longer about great service. It's about know me. Know me as a customer. Understand what I want and then play to that. So to give you a sense of that in government today, we still know you, but we know you as a product. Right? You might use this product or that product, but we have no idea that you have all these products with government. Simple example, you might have a car licence, and many of you, as a result of having a car licence, might have a boat licence. And those of you that have a boat licence will probably have a fishing licence. Now, there's a very logical grouping of 3 simple products. Today, we don't know you across that 3 product set. We only know you down the vertical of 1 product. Now, simple capability, wouldn't it be a great thing for you as a customer of government that we looked at all those 3 products and we said to you, They're all due in the next 6 months. So we go to you via electronic means and we say, here's what you've got, pay now in advance and you'll get a discount of X. I mean, banks have been doing that for how long, and other retailers? We're nowhere near that space. Simple example. And then you get into much more complex transactions where you could link those together as well. So a number of opportunities when you start to think in this way, because this is what you and I want, driven by technology. The penultimate point, we want everything, anytime, anywhere, we want it. One of my other roles is a university role, and what's coming through there very clearly is students want that. If they want to log on and look at particular pieces at 3 a.m. in the morning, they want to be able to do that through the university portal. And you and I have the similar expectations. And then the final point, there are huge debates around privacy. You know, what I'm seeing is that many of us are starting to trade off privacy for a better and more efficient experience with government. So a lot of those privacy concerns are starting to dissipate, and where customers or citizens opt in, it's fundamentally changing that notion of privacy as well. So we launched something called Service New South Wales 12 months ago, or 11 months ago now, 1st of July, and that was to bring together all the transactions at the front end of government that we do. There's about 42 million of those a year. And they're simple transactions at this stage, like those licences, like paying a fine, like a birth certificate, marriage certificate, etc., and bringing all that together. That's the progress to date. One of the keys of success to this is a multi-channel approach. And from the case studies I looked at, there are a number of examples of governments that have launched a contact centre channel or a web channel or a physical channel, but have not done all three. And a key learning from my banking days over a decade ago when we got internet in banking, we all naively thought that once banks launched web capability, that you and I would drop the physical centre, we wouldn't go to a branch, we'd drop the contact centre and we'd all just flock to the internet. Well, of course, we're a lot wiser these days, because what you and I chose to do, and still choose to do, is multi-channel. So we might log on to the internet, we might fill out a form, get stuck somewhere, we want to hit a contact centre operator button, go and speak to someone, and then maybe the next day we want to fulfil that transaction by dropping the form into a branch. We want multi-channel still. And it's a fallacy to say otherwise. I can tell you, I've got a huge amount of research from people like you in this room that tell me that's what you want. That's been a huge success factor here. The trick in this, to manage your cost, is to make sure you're investing more in digital than you are in the physical. And that's a really important balance-free cost. I think the key part of that, on the bottom of those two contact centre, service centre slides there, you'll see the scores 4.91, 4.87. That is customer satisfaction rating that we've got now 12 months in market. I have never seen customer satisfaction rating that high in my whole career. And so clearly we are meeting a need for citizens to deal more efficiently with government. I had a simple example the other day. Every day I get emails or phone calls from citizens about Service New South Wales. And I had one last week who said to me, I went into one of your service centres recently to renew my driver's licence, which I do every couple of years, and I took my book with me because I read a couple of chapters every time I'm there. Well, this time I never got to open my book. She was in and out in 6 minutes. That's really resonating with citizens. So we're heading down the right direction. There's a huge amount more to do. I mean, where I see this going is having my account with government, so that when I log on and I'm validated, I can do all the transactions that I have with government. And so that's, you know, an opportunity for us to think about as we take this work forward. And I can talk more about that if you're interested in Q&A. So what does the future look like? Let me just wrap up quickly. It is about getting citizens or customers much more involved in government and in online transactions, mobile being the key device as we go forward. There's a huge amount of work to do in the back end of government. I'm talking about the front end of government, but we've got to re-engineer the back end of government. Some of our legacy systems, I mean, one agency, for example, in New South Wales can't collect merchant fees because they can't change that in their core system. There's $12 million straight away that we forfeit. So real opportunities here around cost as well. And that's that third point around significant cost and benefits. And then finally, government to become a much more service-oriented organisation. It doesn't have to overly excite you as a citizen. That's not what this is about. It has to meet your need efficiently, on time, get you in and out of there as quickly as we can. So I'll leave it there, and happy to take questions, I think, later. Thank you
very much, Mike. Quick round of applause for Mike. Okay, we're going to move to our next speaker, Martin Laverty. For those of you who don't know, Martin is the CEO of Catholic Healthcare Australia and is also very heavily involved in a range of social welfare and healthcare reforms in Australia. He's a member of the National Disability Insurance Scheme Board, also a member of the New South Wales Public Service Commission Board, and the board chair of the New South Wales Heart Foundation. Would you please join me in welcoming Martin to the stage?
Thank you. Can I commence by acknowledging that we meet today on the country of the Gadigal people, who are a proud part of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to the Gadigal and to any elders past and present that might be with us within the room. I'm a creature of the not-for-profit sector. All of my professional and working life has been involved in NGO or public good that comes from non-government organisations. Today I'm going to provide some reflections that I've had arising from my 10 years on the board of the National Heart Foundation. I was privileged to be the board chair of the Heart Foundation for the last 4 years. The Heart Foundation is one of many NGOs committed to public health campaigns and awareness. And in my discussion today, there are 3 key points that I want to put to you, drawn largely from my experience at the Heart Foundation, but also in observation through watching other public health advocacy organisations, and now my own PhD, which is looking at the effectiveness of governance of not-for-profit health enterprises. The first point I make is that public health campaigns have traditionally focused on awareness through single channels. The public health advocates, like myself, tend to address patients or populations. What they sometimes fail to do is see a customer that needs to be engaged with through multi-channels. The second point I make is that we now have evidence informed and tested through peer-reviewed studies that actually provides the choice architecture informed by our understanding of behavioural insights that is being implemented to see behavioural change to positively affect health outcomes rather than just promote awareness of particular health problems. The third point that I'll conclude on is that even with this knowledge of behavioural insight, NGOs are constrained in their ability to shift behaviour change in certain sections of the community because of the social context in which some disadvantaged Australians live. As the chair of the Heart Foundation, I had the privilege in the final weeks of the premiership of Christina Keneally to meet with her on several occasions to make the case for the publications in fast food restaurants around New South Wales of calorie counts within takeaway meals. It was a significant achievement for the Heart Foundation, an achievement the state government was very proud of. At about the time that the Heart Foundation was also promoting healthy choices on fast food menus, and we saw the Heart Foundation TIC program promoting some choices over other in the supermarket aisle, we had the unfortunate consequence of the publication of a study that says when you include a healthy option in a menu choice, you have the somewhat ironic consequence of inducing an unhealthy food choice. Our behavioural insights tells us, when you draw down on evidence, that as consumers, if we look at a menu board, if we look at a choice of foods and we see the healthy option, we somehow go to choose the unhealthy outcome. For those health advocates, myself included, promoting healthy choice in foods, I was involved in an advocacy campaign seeking public health awareness that was not informing itself on the evidence about how to bring about behavioural change. So we thought at the Heart Foundation, well, obviously the answer to that is social media. We'll supplement our awareness on healthy food choices by a social media campaign? Well, a meta-analysis of the efficacy of some 85 studies involving some 43,000 participants found that social media was tending to have a statistically small impact on achieving behavioural change when it comes to healthy behaviours. A change nonetheless, but statistically small. What that study of studies told us is that the social media channel needs to be one of several that is involved in delivering not just awareness of a public health need, but actually engagement with a customer such that they choose behavioural change. So pleasingly, as our knowledge of behavioural insights has increased, we've now reached the point in public health initiatives that we can point to the 5 multi-channels that again have been tested through meta-analysis as necessary to inform a successful public health behavioural change program. Awareness is not enough. To engage through 5 steps, a public health initiative has a better chance of actually delivering a health improvement through behavioural change. And those 5 steps are relatively straightforward. That having considered 122 studies, we're able to say there needs to be goal setting as the first. There needs to be specific goals that are relevant to the context of the individual. There has to be an active self-monitoring of that behaviour. And this is where social media and technology can start to have its terrific application. There needs to be feedback on performance, either from a person on the other side of the table or through a technological interface. And finally, there's got to be a realistic review of previously set goals. The studies of studies is telling us that as public health advocates seeking health improvement, not just awareness of public health detriment, we need to invest in the multi-channel or multi-engagement approach and not consider populations or patients, but rather consider customers who need to be engaged with through those multiple channels. But there's, of course, a significant constraint, and it's a constraint that perhaps hasn't yet been unpacked in this otherwise terrific conference on behavioural insights. The Statistics Sweden told us at the end of 2011 that a person living in Sweden who completed only their compulsory school education will die, on average, some 5 years earlier than someone who has completed university studies. Catholic Health Australia engaged NATSEM, the National Centre for Social and Economic Modelling, to test this same thesis in Australia. And what we see is a person who only has achieved Year 11 school completion is likely to have 40, or within that group, 46% will have an avoidable chronic illness, compared to only 20% of those that have actually completed university education. If we look at that another way, the lowest 20% of income earners in Australia will die, on average, some 3.5 years earlier than the most affluent among us. And within that, they will suffer 3 times the prevalence of chronic illness. The World Health Organization in 2008 said there is a direct correlation between the social determinants of health and an individual and indeed population health outcome. It is the social context within which an individual lives that so influences their health status. Early childhood experience, whether or not you finish school, safe transition into work, the type of house you live in, indeed whether or not you have housing at all. The College of Surgeons in the United States put it this way. They said, and this is important coming from the bloke from the Heart Foundation, whether or not you finished school better indicates the likelihood of you dying of an avoidable cardiac incident than your blood pressure, your cholesterol, and your prevalence of smoking combined. The College of Surgeons is saying that the social context in which you live, your access to resources, indeed the social capital that you are able to draw down on, is the biggest indicator over and above biological signals as to whether or not you will suffer a mortal cardiovascular incident. These constraints need to be understood in how we approach our knowledge of behavioural insights. And I put it to you, whilst it's not tested, because these two schools of thought perhaps at the moment sit apart, that those of us involved in public health advocacy need to be engaging with populations not as population groups and patients, but as customers. We need to be shaping our multiple touch engagement with them, not about promoting awareness, but around using the tools that result in behavioural change. But within that context, we have to properly understand the different segments of populations both in this country and internationally. And we have to pay particular attention that if we want to address the health outcomes for the most vulnerable among us, it's going to require a special approach to merge together the science of social determinants and the emerging information on behavioural insights.
Thank you, Martin. A very thought-provoking presentation. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Arun Abey, who's the founder of ipac Securities at AMP. Arun has spent over 30 years providing financial advice and in wealth management. He's had the benefit of working in academia, obviously in business, as an entrepreneur, and as a corporate strategy advisor. He's also an accomplished author with a number of international bestsellers. His most recent one being How Much Is Enough, which there was one quote, I think, in the conference program which said, if you read this book, it will not only change, it'll change your life balance, not just your bank balance. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Arun. Would you please welcome him to the stage?
Thank you. 30 years ago, a revolution began in Australia when, thanks to the Hawke-Keating government, we joined the world of globalisation and deregulation. At that time, I was a junior academic at the ANU in economics, and I was also looking at the demographic research showing that longevity was going to massively increase. And as a result of all these things, one of the things I perceived was that the way that Australians saved and used their savings had to actually dramatically change. And I made a leap from academia into business, started ipac Securities with a few other blokes, including a chap called Paul Clitheroe, who's now the chairman of the Australian Government Financial Literacy Foundation. And we had some qualifications, not a huge amount of experience, but some qualifications to actually help people manage their money. What I began to understand was when you start dealing with people's money, you start dealing also with their lives, which I had no qualifications to deal with it at all. The second thing I realised was most of our clients, and ipac today is a very, very large firm. It's probably the largest financial advice wealth management firm in this country outside of the big banks, with about 40,000 clients. And most of our clients are people like yourselves, well-educated, fairly affluent. People actually well-educated, fairly affluent people make appalling financial decisions. And in fact, the greater the education, I can pretty well guarantee the worse the financial decisions and the harder the person is to actually deal with. And I'm going to actually show you some evidence to that effect. While I love the concept of nudge, 20 years ago, frankly, in economics, there was nothing useful to actually provide an explanation for this. So why I love behavioural research, which has emerged, I guess, in the last 10, 15, 20 years, is it starts to provide an insight into it and also some sense of what you can actually do. But my talk, while I love nudge, goes beyond nudge. It's really about trying to hit the ball out of the park in dealing with some issues which are really quite important. So one of the big issues which frankly fundamentally affects the well-being of people in our country, and indeed around the world, is what I call the pro-cyclical monster. And that is investors, the way that people, and all of us in this country are investors because of compulsory super and the need to save for retirement and so on, that notwithstanding decades, my colleague Paul Clitheroe and indeed myself have got up at God knows how many seminars and talked about the fundamentals of good investment. And I can tell you, your pet goldfish and pet parrot knows it. Your pet goldfish knows that what you need to do is to buy a good quality portfolio of stocks, make sure you don't pay too much, and then hang on to it. Anyone heard that before? In the last 30 years, time and time again, a parrot can actually repeat it. Virtually no one does it. That's the problem. So the pro-cyclical monster simply says that investors chase markets. And as a consequence of that, they actually massively end up underperforming. Now, one of the things I love about America is that they do actually measure everything. There's an organisation there called DALBAR, which in a sense goes out and measures people's behaviour and looks at the consequences. And DALBAR in the 20 years to 2012 said, look, the American stock market on average produced a return of 8.2% per annum. And if people had actually used that market well by buying good quality stocks, doing what, if you like, what Warren Buffett does and hanging on to it, that's what they'd have actually got. And it would massively change their financial outcomes. But because of the consequence of chasing returns, and as a consequence of chasing returns, buying when the markets are high, and then panicking and selling when the markets are low, the average investor in America actually managed to halve that return. Right, this is research that's looking at when money goes into markets and when money goes out of markets to work out what the average return of the investor is as distinct from the average return of the market. That's 4% different over 20 years is a massive difference in return. In Australia, there's about $3 trillion of investable funds, of retail investable funds. Superannuation comprises about $2 trillion of that. Now, the cost of poor, if we apply those same statistics to Australia, if we say that the average Australian underperforms the market by simply 1%, not 4%, by 1%, that's a cost to the average person to that pool of $30 billion. If it's 2%, it's $60 billion. If the American stats are right, and the average person underperforms by 4%, that's a $120 billion cost. That has a massive impact on retirement outcomes, absolutely massive. Of course, the other love affair which Australians have is with property. And again, we see a similar phenomenon with property. Probably the most dangerous words I've ever heard in investment. And if your neighbour or anyone actually makes a recommendation and says words like this to you, you should actually shoot them. It's, I can't go wrong with. I can't go wrong with. And the most typical attachment to that phrase in Australia is, I can't go wrong with property. Now, having studied every financial crisis in the world since 1720, I'd say stock market crashes are exciting, but they pale into insignificance compared to property market crashes. And every major global financial crisis is linked to a crash in property markets. Part of the behavioural problem with property is that because property is perceived, because the property price, your home is not actually measured on a daily basis, unlike the stock market, and so property is perceived to be far safer than it is. It means that the property cycle ends up becoming far, far worse, both on the way up, but also on the way down, than the stock market cycle. What this chart is showing is this. It's showing, on the one hand, that the return you could get from investing in a diversified portfolio of good quality commercial property by, say, investing in, say, the Westfield Trust or any one of a number of other trusts is about 10% per annum over whatever time period that is. Now, this is a highly liquid, highly secure, with bumps along the way, but highly liquid, highly secure, good quality portfolio. When one invests in residential property, we should be demanding a premium, because this is a far riskier thing to do than investing in Westfield Trust or Stockland Trust or something like that. But no, by and large, Australians the way we've priced residential property is to get more or less the same return, or indeed a somewhat lower return, than a much higher quality portfolio. It's resulted in massive distortions in returns and in investment patterns in this country. Again, it's undermined our financial resources and undermined retirement. So what can we actually do about this? And this is where I think it goes beyond nudges. Some years ago, I began writing my latest book called How Much Is Enough? And How Much Is Enough began as a book about taking the research on behavioural finance and behavioural economics out of the realm of academia and translating it into English and making it accessible, if you like, to a non-academic audience. And it was interesting and fascinating research, but fundamentally I was feeling dissatisfied. I was saying, look, I'm explaining why people keep on screwing up decisions, and having actually built the ipac business in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Dublin of all places, and various parts of Asia, I'd seen the evidence, but explaining the behaviours wasn't the same as actually changing them. And the limitation of behavioural finance and behavioural economics is fundamentally around how do we change behaviour in a more fundamental way. But halfway through the book, I came across work in behavioural psychology, and thanks to a gentleman called Shlomo Benartzi, who's one of the great researchers in this area. He linked me to the work of people like Martin Seligman. And Martin Seligman's a psychologist in Pennsylvania, and he's developed a thing called positive psychology, which is really looking at how people make decisions relating to their happiness. And the interesting thing about behavioural psychology is it says that people systematically make poor decisions in terms of their happiness. So behavioural finance says we systematically make poor decisions in terms of our financial well-being, and behavioural psychology is the same in terms of happiness. And my thesis was maybe it's the same neural pathways which are causing this problem. And I spent a fair bit of time in America meeting up with people like Shlomo, Dick Thaler, Martin Seligman, and so on. Where positive psychology has made much more advances in a big picture sense than behavioural finance or economics is in developing a fairly broad program on how do you improve people's decision-making around well-being. There's now probably about 15 to 20 years of research on this. So How Much Is Enough ended up drawing together these two strands of research. And I don't have time to really go into the fine detail of it, but the essence of the thesis is this, that is to change people's behaviour, you need to actually get people to actually look within. Yesterday during lunchtime, there was a fantastic video quoting people like Tim Kasser, talking about the importance of intrinsic motivation as distinct from extrinsic motivation. So in other words, when you can actually centre people on what is important to them, when you can get people to actually focus on their values rather than on what other people are doing and try to follow the herd, then you start to set up the foundations of more disciplined behaviour. And fundamentally at the heart of better financial decisions, fundamentally at the heart of improving investment behaviour, is that sense of being centred, that sense of not being, if you like, torn from pillar to post by the action and behaviours of others. And there's a major education program in this area. Geelong Grammar is, as we know, the wealthiest school in this country. Has a very long history. Prince Charles went there, which may or may not be a good thing. But Geelong Grammar, having tracked the performance of their students leaving that school, and this is the wealthiest cohort of students in this country, found that their students systematically were underperforming on every metric of well-being in terms of drug abuse, addiction, university dropout, the works. To their credit, they decided to do something about that. They flew Martin Seligman. They spent $17 million, only Geelong could do this. They've spent $17 million in building a well-being program, including flying out Martin Seligman for a year to that school, and at various times 13 members of his faculty to build well-being into the ethos of that school. It's one of the great experiments going on. It began 5 years ago. It's starting to have some impact. In the Smith family, which I'm a director of, we've managed to try and take some elements of that program and to design a program called Money for Wellbeing, which is a program which is trying to teach what we call emotional financial literacy. Financial literacy in isolation probably doesn't change people's behaviour. It's necessary but not sufficient. Emotional financial literacy is about a very focused intervention which starts off by teaching students the essence of positive psychology, the essence of how to discover what are the drivers of well-being, and by that mechanism, hoping that you start to affect longer-term well-being. The program's actually gone through 2 pilot phases. It was independently audited by RMIT, and the encouraging thing after 3 months is we were finding that we were starting to create the foundations of longer-term well-being. So let me, and better financial decisions. So let me conclude by saying this. If we want to actually affect longer-term fundamental changes in behaviour, especially around money, I think we need to broaden our behavioural lens, not just to be about behavioural economics and behavioural finance, but to also draw on the very interesting advances in research in behavioural psychology. And I guess my key learning so far is not that money buys happiness, but fun enough, if we discover the deeper lessons of where happiness comes from, it can actually buy money. Thank you.
Thank you, Arun. Last but by no means least, let me introduce Tim Fawcett, who's the General Manager of Government Affairs for Cisco. Tim chairs Cisco's Australia-New Zealand Social Innovation and Corporate Responsibility Committee, and we've heard this morning about the connection between BI and corporate social responsibility, and leads Cisco's engagement with government across a diverse range of portfolios of government and public policy. He also represents Cisco on the Australian Government's advisory panel on teleworking. Would you please welcome Tim to the stage?
Thanks. Well, thanks, everyone. You've had the Commissioner and successful CEO. You've had the Chairman and also successful CEO, the financial guru and author, and then you've got the IT geek. You've really lucked out. Actually, my background is history. I'm a history major with an economics public policy background, so perhaps I won't talk a lot about switching and routing. I'll try and focus a little bit more on what I think is one of the emerging themes of this conference, which is this intersect between technology, behavioural insights, behavioural economics and nudge. Can I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land? Much like Martin, Cisco has a reconciliation action policy, and that's one of the things we do at major events, the Gadigal Nation, their land, their waters and their community, and pay my respects to elders past and present. Can I also thank and congratulate the New South Wales Government, and particularly the Behavioural Insights Group at Department of Premier and Cabinet for organising this conference. The fact that there's so many people here and it's so well attended and people came back for the second day indicates how big, important issue this is. And it's great to see the Behavioural Insights unit being extended across a whole range of different policy areas, family and community services, health, transport and other agencies. And also I know other governments around Australia and the federal government in particular are also adopting these principles and investing in these principles, the ATO, DHS and CSIRO, who we've seen presentations from at this conference. Cass Sunstein made the point yesterday that we're really at the tip of the iceberg with this discipline. And if I was to draw a line across the room from that speaker over there, about shoulder height, all the way over here, over there is the emergence of anatomically modern human beings around about 250,000 years ago, all the way over here to the present day. About the width of my shoulders is the amount of time that we've been organising as humans in cities of more than 5,000 people. About the width of my finger is when the Industrial Revolution happened. And about the width of one of my ever-decreasing hairs is the emergence of this discipline. And I was struck yesterday by how much the discussion is kind of, I wouldn't say groping's the right word, but we're trying to find a platform or a pathway forward for how this discipline can be applied in our own jobs, in our own organisations, in our own communities. And so I'd like to remind people of what Cass said. We're really at the start of this journey on behavioural economics and behavioural insights, and I think Adam Ferrier made a good point about that last night in his highly entertaining speech. So my interest is in the way that technology can be applied in public policy delivery, and also in the way that public servants are using technology in their everyday lives and governments are deploying it for their workforce. And the behavioural insights, I think, or the way behavioural insights can actually draw on that. Quite clearly, technology and tech-based platforms has been mentioned a number of times, both in the presentations we've had already, but also yesterday. The Treasurer kicked it off by saying we're seeing government by smartphone. David Halpin described several projects where technology platforms are being used to actually deliver behavioural insight-driven programs. Jill Rector from the CEO of Vic Health yesterday gave a very interesting a presentation, challenged somewhat by Martin's presentation today, actually, around the way social media is being used to deliver public health messages and public health campaigns, and so on with the other agencies that we've seen. So I'll be talking a little bit about that intersect between technology and public policy program delivery. When you do courses on presentations, they often say you ought to start with something big. So I tried to find a picture of what would be something big to begin with, and I picked that one. Does anyone seen that? That's a picture of the 11th Battalion. I saw it about 6 weeks ago when we celebrated Anzac Day. The 11th Battalion, 3rd Division, WA, at the Great Pyramid of Khufu, or Cheops, as some of you may have known. It's an iconic photo, Australians in exotic lands about to enter the world stage as we unfortunately entered World War I. And given what Cass Sunstein said yesterday about the one thing he wanted us to remember from his presentation was plate, not pyramid. And I thought, oh my God, there he goes, he's stuffed up my metaphor to start with. But look in your packs at his slide pack in your presentation, in your conference packs. The way they've used the pyramid is quite strange, actually, in the United States. I think we've got it horizontally and they've got it vertically. But anyway, I'll push on. So that, of course, is the Great Pyramid of Cheops. Has anyone been there and seen it? Yeah, a few hands. It's pretty impressive, isn't it? It's the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that's still intact. It's about just under 4,000 years old. 150 metres high, which when you stand at the base of it, it's huge. Each block's about 1.5 metres high. Took 20 years to build. We'll ignore the fact that it was done with slave labour. And it's a remarkable feat of engineering and architecture. And it's had the world's great influences that have either climbed it or been around it. Napoleon, Alexander the Great, David Beckham. Anyone of those who've seen it, did anyone try and climb it? Or climb it? That's pretty sensible. Well, when I was 22 years old, I actually climbed that pyramid all the way to the top in the dark at about 4 o'clock in the morning, which at the time seemed like a good idea. But it made me think in terms of behavioural insights and the way we formulate public policy in particular and deliver programs, is what would drive a 22-year-old man with the world at his feet, thinks he's relatively well educated and smart, to do something that's both illegal and actually quite dangerous. About a dozen people die from trying to climb it, so they sort of banned it. And when I got to the top, I thought it'd be a good idea to take flash photographs while I was up there, and which wasn't the smartest thing because it immediately attracted a whole bunch of police to coax me down. But anyway, you know, why did I climb it? The Sir Edmund Hillary defence, because it was there. Perhaps it seemed like a good idea at the time, or probably more likely I was trying to impress someone, a girl or something. But it made me think of that metaphor, made me think of in that sort of idiotic act that I undertook then. It made me think about the way we design public policies to tackle things that particularly young men do, and we certainly know that they are very poorly represented in the statistics around early death and through road trauma, through suicide, or through a whole range of public policy challenges or wicked problems. And it reminded me of the campaign that the Transport Accident Commission uses in Victoria, the Wipe Off 5 campaign. Many of you probably heard of that, where they've made a decision that in any population of cars in a big city, there'll always be a certain number of deaths, which, while you should try and prevent, by and large, there's sort of a natural number which you'll always have. But one of the big public policy problems for insurance schemes like that is the number of people who get injured with head injuries or back injuries or things like that, which of course pull down on the public purse then for the rest of that person's life. So the Wipe Off 5 campaign is about reducing speed by 5 kilometres to actually try and prevent those major traumatic injuries that occur, not necessarily prevent a death. And behavioural insights is being used to actually try and make those programs a lot more impactful and reduce that number. So I like to imagine that the Egyptians must have thought that their pyramids would be eternal symbols of their empire, their beliefs, their power, and nothing in the world could possibly match their majesty. And for nearly 4,000 years, that was the case. That was the tallest structure on the earth for 4,000 years. Then the English came along and built the Lincoln Cathedral, which, while a very impressive building, I'm certainly not going to try and climb that. They use new technologies, new techniques, new materials, new architectures to build that. And that was in 1311. So it reminded me of this concept of disruption, that even when you think you're doing something the right way or you got the biggest or the best, there's always a chance of having that disrupted. So shifting now to the public service and the examples of disruption in public service delivery using technology. In Barcelona, they've adopted an Internet of Everything citywide sensor network where they've deployed sensors right throughout the city to help manage traffic flows, improve the efficiency of waste collection, water usage, street lighting, parking metering. They've saved in 1 year $58 million for more efficient water use. $500 million increase in parking revenue from using sensors to detect when a car was in a car park. And then they can send a parking inspector to go and find that person when the meter expires. And they've created 47,000 jobs. And there's plenty of examples of that on a website called theinternetofeverything.com with a lot of detailed case studies if you're interested. The Australian government uses technology a lot through its national telepresence system, which some of you may have used, which saves $1.4 million a month in travel avoided through public servants that are involved in the COAG process, the COAG committee process. So we're already seeing innovations where technology is changing the way activity is taking place in the public sector. One I wanted to show you, which is emerging, was this one, the Brisbane City Council's deployment of a video booth in Indooroopilly Shopping Centre. And effectively, you go into the booth while you're doing your shopping in the shopping centre, and you can transact with the call centre for the council. You could pay your rates, you could pay a fine, you could order a green waste bin, you could report that there's a pothole outside your road or in your footpath. In the first 3 weeks that they deployed that, 700 people visited it and used it. And when you walk in, you are immediately linked to through high-definition video, which many of you have seen the power of today, to the council's call centre. So you can actually have a visual and verbal engagement with the council's call centre. The interesting thing about this is it's positioned in a shopping centre which is over the road from a council shop front. Now, I'm not sure why they did that, actually. Maybe it was because that was the shopping centre that agreed to let them do it. But it was probably a pretty good idea, because if someone got into trouble, they could just say, come over the road and we'll fix you. But I'm not sure if that was the driver. But 700 people went in there in the first 3 weeks rather than go over the road to the shop front, which says to me there's some insight happening there. I must say they did actually employ a person to help people when they first developed it, to use it. But in the end, people didn't need to be there and people just started using it themselves. So there's an evaluation taking place of this program, and I think it's looking very, very positive for the Brisbane Council's deployment of this, and they will be potentially looking to try and roll these out further. But again, behavioural insights can be used to actually analyse what's driving, motivating people to actually adopt these technologies. And finally, I'll show you a picture of Cisco's Chief Technology Officer in our Singapore office in what we call our Cisco Connected Workspace. Now, I'm sure if these sort of rooms and facilities were rolled out across the public sector, it might not pass the Telegraph mirror test for public servants getting a bashing in the media. But this, of course, is but one room that we use in what we call our Cisco connected workspace, where we have rolled out activity-based work models and mobility and teleworking capability across our entire workforce around the world, 75,000 people. And what it's enabled us to do is actually to drive down costs and increase productivity at the same time. And I know a lot of Australian governments are actually starting to adopt this technology now. The New South Wales government, for example, Mike, is looking at trialling smart work centres. The Victorian Parliament actually produced a report encouraging the Victorian government to adopt teleworking as a target for a number of its employees. And the Australian government already had a 12% teleworking target. And that's going to change the way that the public service works. So to pick on David Leibson's yesterday, his commitment contract for public servants and their employers, if I offered you a reduced or no commute, more time with your family, lower greenhouse gas emissions, improving your well-being, and greater productivity, which the Melbourne University study suggests is at least 12% for hybrid teleworkers, people who work from home a couple of days of the week, would you take that up? We know from research that a lot of people resist that, actually, that contract. And again, I think behavioural insights can be used to actually shed some light on that. So in conclusion, I think BI is a wonderful discipline. I'm really excited about the intersect, the way that technology is working on it, and I think it can be extremely useful for disrupting the status quo, and that's one of the key things I've taken out of the conference. So thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Well, folks, we've got about 20 minutes of time for you to pose questions to the panel. As always, there'll be a roving mic, so if you have a question, raise your hand. If you want to introduce yourself to the panel and ask your question, that's fine. While you're getting yourself psyched up to ask that question you've been working on for the last half hour, I might just ask a question, Mike, of you. A lot of discussion today around the impact of technology, and I suppose the disruptive and transformative power of technology in terms of customer experience. I'm interested, though, in terms of the impact of physical environment. And I know the government's put a lot of work into trying to, I suppose, change the concept of the service centre or the shop front. And we've seen the BCC example, which sort of looks like a demountable, a very nice looking demountable in a shopping centre. And obviously the work that's gone into creating the one-stop shop service centres for New South Wales Government. So any insight in terms of, I suppose, the impact of the physical environment on consumer behaviour that you've seen through the work the government's done?
I think what I'm seeing is there's a very good parallel, I guess reflecting somewhat my background with banking as well. If you go back a decade ago, the bulk of the population clearly still wanted to go into a physical branch to deal with whatever that it might be. Increasingly now, and if I straw polled this room, I think we'd find that in terms of basic transactions, have really moved to the internet through whatever device. So that, you know, if I looked at banking transactions by channel a few years ago, about 90% now of transactions in this country were done via the internet, be it on your mobile device, your iPad, etc. So that has really moved. What we're seeing in government at that basic transaction level is a desire to do exactly the same thing. So what we're looking at with the planning we're doing into the next phase of delivery is very much around, in fact, Tim, the digital booth is something that we've got in trial right now. And we're hearing from citizens that's what they want. So if you look at the digital booth idea, we could put that in hospitals, we could put it in airports, we could put it in regional locations where you don't have all the high-cost infrastructure of CapEx investment in buildings, but rather in something of that capability. And so we've just completed for government here what I call a distribution strategy for government. And if you look at government today, to give you a sense of the challenge and the opportunity, there are 402 offices of government in this state today where we face you as a citizen. There are 104 contact centres, believe it or not, in the New South Wales government. Now, parallel in banking, if you look at the major banks here, they would have about 3 contact centres nationally to service their clients. We have that number in one state to service this state. Now, if you think about both the inconvenience factor and the cost, getting a better understanding of what the right distribution strategy footprint for delivery is really important. And so our future really around this will be very much, as I indicated, around digital. It will be the digital booth approach. It will be much more on the mobile. It'll be a lot of apps around certain things. It'll be my account with government. I mean, that is absolutely the direction that citizens want.
Yeah. Martin, I think you had an observation you wanted to make.
There's a similar transition underway in both health and aged care as well, but it's one where the evidence is actually ahead of political and consumer expectations right now. Every time an election comes round, or if you're a health minister, you have to announce more hospital beds. In fact, health policy says you should be decreasing the number of hospital beds that you have in a community, because increasingly better clinical outcomes are achieved by hospital in the home, by treating people that need the clinical service in the hospital, but then ensuring that a healthy person goes home. A similar trend is happening in aged care, that once upon a time it was seen that you had to have the physical environment, and that if you reached a point of frailty, you had to be admitted to aged care. Now, let me just declare my bias. Catholic Health Australia is the network that runs 10% of the nation's acute hospital beds and 10% of the nation's residential aged care beds. So we've got a stake in bricks and mortar. But in the future, what we need is a new understanding of the virtual healthcare environment, where consumers will probably get a better health outcome in their own homes, a better aged care support in their own homes, when we trust and integrate the role of technology appropriately. Now, fundamental to that is the much hoped for, still years away, electronic healthcare record, that we can't have health delivery in the right place at the right time until we've got the different bits of our health architecture all in the right place. So in order to have the infrastructure in place, we've got to get the data working, and then I think we'll be in a much better position to give that confidence back to health customers that the traditional environment, to Mike's old-fashioned bank that you went into, well, the future healthcare environment is increasingly going to be in your own home, where you have the comforts and protections of your own environment.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the floor for our panel? Yes, we've got a question over here, please. We can get a mic down the front.
Hi, Glenn Brodie from the New South Wales Office of State Revenue. I guess my question was really the bookending Mike's opening comments in regard to the obvious focus on client service, and then the final comments in regard to working from home and, you know, the technology, the way we could use it. So I guess what I was going to put to you was there's a multiplying effect in my mind if we look at behavioural insights and the way that we apply that to our staff, not necessarily to our clients. Your thoughts, I suppose, on what effort we should be putting into nudging our staff in the right direction, trying to actually get them to apply the knowledge and understanding that clearly is necessary to get client behaviours changed.
Thank you. Anyone like to offer a comment? It's interesting that the application of nudge and BI to within organisations and change the organisational culture. I might start with you. I mean, obviously, big focus on teleworking, and I know that can be quite challenging in terms of changing managerial behaviour, which is very much, if I can't see my staff, they must be doing something wrong. Just maybe to start with Cisco, and I suppose maybe just some observations about whether you've seen the application of BI within your organisation.
Absolutely. Well, you've picked the right issue, and that is that most of the resistance towards staff working outside of the traditional bricks and mortar environment is usually from so-called middle managers that, you know, have fears, and some of them are rightly placed or completely appropriate, that you know, people will skive off and, God forbid, they do their work in their pyjamas at home, which is the one that always gets mentioned. Look, 40% of staff at Cisco don't work in the same city as their manager, 40%. So, by definition, you have to be able to work remotely, and managers have to manage remotely. So we invest quite significantly in training programs for managers to teach them not only about the use of the technology tools, and as a maker and seller of these technology tools, of course, we should use them extensively. Do as we do, not as we say. But also in the way that you actually physically engage with staff in a digital environment. And I'm sure Mike would be able to make a comment about the work that goes into training call centre staff or contact staff around, how to engage with someone in a digital platform. So, look, that's why I brought it up at the conference, because the notion of using BI or nudge theory on staff. There's also a lot of resistance from staff that have been around for a long time. I want my cubicle with my 15 square feet or whatever it is, and my ability to put my picture up or my coffee cup or something like that. And the concept of walking in every day, swiping your badge and finding a seat, a workstation to work from with your laptop or your smart device or your smart tablet or smartphone is quite challenging.
Thank you.
Can I just make a comment? I think there is a terrific book written by a couple of Harvard professors in the late 90s called The Service Profit Chain. And the hypothesis at its core goes back to say that if you've got satisfied employees, you've got a much better opportunity to have satisfied customers. And it starts with a value chain that starts with internal re-engineering of process within the organisation and service quality, and then the conditions that people work in, and obviously leadership is a key to that. But I would say in the public sector, we don't spend enough time on that, from what I've observed. We don't have, for example, the sort of leadership development programs that I would expect to see. That we actually help leaders understand that there's a big step up to being a leader from being a middle-level manager, for example. So I think it's core, and I think if we are looking end-to-end, which we should be, I've been talking today a lot about the front-end delivery and a lot of the technology implications, but the broader program I talked about, Customer Inside, we're putting a lot of emphasis on this white paper on employee engagement and how we take that forward. So I fully agree with your comment, but it's a very significant piece of work to do.
Okay. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, we have one down here at the front. Sorry, the mic. Sorry. The mic is coming.
Hello, Mike Daniels from the Behavioural Architects. First of all, thank you, each of the speakers. Really interesting presentations from each of you. My question is actually for Martin, and it's a bit of a tactical question, I think. You mentioned that the licensing effects around when people see healthy food on a menu, that they are more likely to choose unhealthy food. It'd be great to hear if you have any ideas or thoughts as to how you might encourage the healthier choice by changing the context around that.
So pleasingly, that same study that pointed to this perverse outcome of seeing healthy, choosing bad option, actually told us what the toolkit was to be able to bring about the health outcome of the health food choice. And it said you have to start with an acknowledgement of the capacity of the person making the decision. And I think that's something that's relevant to how we understand behavioural insights in Australia in relation to segmenting different audiences or different parts of the market we're talking to. What is the educational attainment? What is the financial capacity of the individual to make a decision, because it has direct bearing on the outcome they will make. Public policy advocates are continually perplexed why that we see an over-representation of obesity in the most financially disadvantaged groups in Australia, and that direct correlation to the types of diets that disadvantaged groups are purchasing. The second needed to be the ease of the choice itself, so that there needed to be a recognition that to make the healthy choice, the provider or the promoter needs to make the decision easy. But then when it became sophisticated, if you wanted to develop programs that actually ingrained so that it became systematised, and I'll speak from personal experience. I went on to the Heart Foundation board because I have a genetic predisposition to cardiovascular disease. I have high cholesterol and I love cheese. I needed to have that process of goal setting, development of accountabilities, and subsequently my cholesterol and absence of cheese are now a happy marriage. So the study that said we choose bad food choices when we are given the option of the healthy actually comes with the toolkit as to how you engage properly in those decisions that individuals make. But I think underpinning it all, and I was really pleased when I saw this program that had me following the New South Wales Customer Service Commissioner. Health professionals go through their training to put their best effort into treating patients, and thank God that they do. But at some point, as the health community, we have to start seeing individuals as customers, not as populations, not as patients that are to be made aware of healthy choices, but rather we engage with individuals as customers, which requires marketing our message through a multi-channel way to ensure a health improvement is achieved, not just awareness of the bad healthy option.
Any other questions from the floor? Yes, we've got one here at the front. Oh, well done, the mic is... Sorry, the tables don't make it easy, do they? Thank you.
My question is for Arun. I was wondering if you could explain a little bit or provide a bit more detail about the initiative that would incorporate the behavioural finance and the well-being literature and the positive psychology literature, and what that program or the Smith family program, or how that might look like, a little bit more detail.
Right. It has a parallel with what Martin was just talking about in terms of healthy choices and his own personal experience with disciplining his diet, if I can use that term. And it says that behavioural change begins by looking intrinsically and working out what are important goals for you. It's a basic concept in psychology of congruence. And the relevance of congruence to well-being is that if you're living a life where the decisions you're making are in accordance with your deepest values, then by and large your well-being is enhanced. The insights we get from behavioural research is that often the context of decision-making, be it diet, be it financial services, be it a whole range of things, don't really encourage us to look within, to look intrinsically, and to link it to our values. But if you can, I guess, design processes where people start off their decision making with that sense of innermost goals, and then you provide some education, that's kind of the steps to then lead to better decision making. The essence of the Smith family program. The Smith family sadly didn't have $17 million to, unlike Geelong Grammar, to actually design a whole new education program. But I'd encourage all of you who are interested in behavioural research to keep an eye on Geelong, because it is probably the greatest experiment anywhere in the world. I mean, the reason Martin Seligman, who's an extraordinarily expensive person, went and spent a year in Geelong, for God's sake, is it's the one school in the world which has put in the resources to behavioural change in the most fundamental way. And we can all learn from all sorts of ways, be it from a New South Wales government perspective and so on. The Smith family program, which was a quick intervention, was a constrained intervention, was saying, can we take the essence of it, can we take the guts of this process, distill it into a series of 6 workshops for 18-year-olds was the first program, which on the one hand gives them the tools to look within and to understand how to go about goal setting, gives them some knowledge, and then gives them a set of strategies to actually apply in day-to-day life. And then the purpose of the RMIT investigation about 6 months later was to check, have we actually changed the needle in terms of behaviour or not? And the answer was, in some respects, yes, and in other respects, we need to keep on improving it.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, thank you.
From the New South Wales Office of Finance and Services. I just wondered if the panel wanted to comment, given the wealth of experience in both public, private and not-for-profit sectors before us, on some of the discussions we've already touched upon this morning about whether they see different challenges in taking forward behavioural insights in those different contexts.
You want to start?
I'll offer an illustration of a study, again, that the Heart Foundation and the Australian Health and Hospitals Association conducted across 15 emergency departments on the east coast of Australia. And health, of course, is the home of the randomised trial that so much has been a discussion of today, but health is not always itself terrific at implementing findings of its own randomised trials. The study found that an Indigenous person admitted to an emergency department with the same cardiovascular presentation symptoms as a non-Indigenous person was 60% less likely to get a stent, 40% less likely to get a CABG, and had a 3 times greater mortality risk. So that says in 15 emergency departments across Australia, an Indigenous person was 3 times more likely to die when presenting with exactly the same clinical cardiovascular symptoms as a non-Indigenous person. Now, very pleasingly, the point of the study was looking at what interventions, what behavioural changes of the system were necessary in order to ameliorate and to close that gap. And we saw from the outcome of those findings there were 5 different admission protocols that needed to be followed, and the addition of some pretty standardised testing onto admission forms. So there was a review of the admission architecture. But even when that was done, the trial that continued on implementing across the 15 emergency departments the same tool found a variability in the clinical outcome. We had the tool that was working in some of those EDs, but it wasn't consistent across. So I think one of the things that I'm thinking about as we take the message as to how do we go home into our own organisations and implement this thinking of behavioural insights, it's the reality that even when best intentions, random controlled trials with findings that are robust get implemented and you've got the change agents willing to pursue them, for reasons I can't put my finger on in that illustration, we saw variability across systems. For those of us involved in government, for those of us involved in NGOs, our lives are systems, and systems are difficult, and they're variable according to geographies and personalities. So I wonder, how do we take that interaction of our emerging knowledge of BI into the reality of the variances in systems and achieve a consistency in outcome rather than a mismatch across the country or a state?
Mike, I'm just interested in terms of that whole concept of knowledge management and the transfer of knowledge of what works in one context and then spreading it through a workforce. Is that something that you've invested in Service New South Wales in terms of sharing successes of what works and what doesn't?
Absolutely. In fact, the old adage of steal ideas shamelessly, we've been absolutely first class at. So, for example, externally, we've been working with Virgin here in Australia, who are generally recognised in the private sector as an organisation that has really stepped up on customer service. So they were a mass market airline. They've gone up the value chain to premium, and they've gone through a huge culture change. And so we've leveraged their induction and training capability for people coming into Service New South Wales. But a broader issue I wanted to raise in response to the question was really something we haven't talked about today, and that is the whole issue of culture. Because if I look at what we are effectively doing as a major change program, frankly, the technology pieces we've been talking about with respect to Tim and Cisco, but are the easy parts. The really difficult part is the culture change. And government bureaucracy, by definition, plays defence, not offence. And we all understand the reasons for that. But we are incredibly into risk avoidance and really trying to close down debate, etc., and many issues. And so when we're confronted with an issue, that's our immediate behavioural response. And so a large part of what we have to think through is how do we go about changing the culture in a way that's supportive of this program, where we are more transparent by definition, we have more open government, but manage these other issues around the avoidance and the risk, etc. So that's a much bigger issue that we're only just starting to really understand and to tackle.
I just wanted to make a point that I think Nick Ruin made a great point yesterday about, hunches. The sort of implication of some of the discussion in this conference has been that public policy formulation and program delivery to date hasn't had any evidence behind it because behavioural insights is random control trials and evidence-based policy and things like that. And I thought Nick brought a refreshing idea to the table, which is we've heard of nudge, but what about hunch? And that to me would implies a bit of boldness around public policy development and formulation. I'm not saying there ought not be any evidence, there ought be, but this concept that David Halpin spoke about formulate the framework and then test and retest, I think that's really positive for the discipline.
Okay. Well, guys, we're on time. I think we're sitting between you and lunch, although lunch is that way. But look, can you join me once again in thanking our panel?